Welcome to the Central Asia Center podcast series produced by the New Lines Institute. I'm your host, Dr. Dania Arayssi. I'm a senior analyst at the New Lines Institute, and I work on and I'm leading the Central Asia Centers on the S7 project. Today, we bring you a conversation that sits at the very heart of the most consequential and arguably most underreported geopolitical realignment that's happening in the region. Specifically, we're talking about the partnership and the ongoing relationship between the United States and Kazakhstan, what it means for the broader Central Asia, and what is that relationship is really looking like. And then at the Center for Central Asia Centers and the New Lines Institute is really kind of dedicated to producing policy-relevant analysis on these regions and emerging periphery of global affairs that occupy a central role in greater power. Today, we are also being grateful and honored to welcome Richard to be part of our conversation today. And there is really perhaps no better place to guide this analysis without having Richard Spooner, a senior fellow at the Caspian Policy Center, and also he's on the board member since 2022. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And one of the Washington's leading independent research institutions that focus on economic, political, energy, and security dimensions of the Caspian and Central Asian region. Richard's background is extraordinary. I will start by Richard holds a bachelor's and a master's degree in Russian and East European studies from Yale University and has spent decades embedded in the region itself. In the 1980s, he served as a senior project manager in Moscow, office of the USSR Trade and Economic Council, and then as head of the Moscow office of the American Trade Consortium, a body that includes Chevron corporations, before relocating to Kazakhstan in March 1992. For 15 years, Richard coordinated teams of Western legal, financial, and technical consultants advising the government of Kazakhstan on attracting foreign investment to the oil and gas sector, including the landmark
Karachaganak.
Thank you. CPC and Kazan project, which remain the backbone of Kazakhstan economy to this date. He has since worked as an independent consultant providing risk assessment and advisory services across the former Soviet space. And currently, Richard advises a major U.S. corporations on agro-industry investment project in Kazakhstan. Richard has been member of the Caspian Policy Center advisory board since 2022 and is based full-time in Astana, giving him a genuine on-the-ground experience and also perspective that very few in Washington have, given that you are on the region. And so thank you so much, Richard, for being with us and for joining this conversation today.
It's my pleasure to be with you, Dania, today.
Thank you so much. I want to start with the big picture. Okay. So my first question is, let's start with a 30,000 kind of view of what's happening in the region. Over the course of 2025, Central Asia went from a region that Washington barely really mentioned to one that right now we're seeing it being mentioned almost all the times by the White House. The White House is holding summits. We have billions of deals, economic deals that are being signed or at least also discussed on the table. Mm-hmm. And even right now, we're seeing Kazakhstan involved in a lot of Middle Eastern affairs politics. Just recently, the president of Kazakhstan visited Washington and joined the summit, the Gaza summit here in Washington. So my question is, what has been the mood on the ground in Kazakhstan when it comes to this relationship and this realignment between United States and Kazakhstan that has genuinely, we didn't see it for a long time happening. And what does that look like for the broader Central Asia region?
I think Kazakhstan unquestionably welcomes this new relationship, this new stronger and more visible relationship with Washington. As you said, Central Asia has not been in the center of Washington's attention. We still have never had a visit by a U.S. president to Central Asia. Maybe that'll change, maybe not. But in any case, the relationship is now different. And I think the first sign was the summit last year, November 5, when President Trump invited all 5 Central Asian leaders to Washington, D.C. for meetings. People outside of government in Kazakhstan, I believe, are also very glad to see this happening. If you look at the picture in terms of economics, this is good for Kazakhstan business. And of course, I would say, time to mention critical minerals, because that's really the engine driving this new relationship.
Right.
Kazakhstan has very good reserves of rare earth minerals and critical minerals, and in addition does have some processing capacity and does have the infrastructure in place, energy, transportation, and other logistics to do what is most important now, which is not just to mine the minerals, but to also process them and refine them, hopefully, into finished products. In other words, use the whole value chain. It has to be about that now, because if in Kazakhstan companies begin mining critical minerals, but they're still sent to the same place to be processed, then that's a very vulnerable supply chain, and we don't have to look far to see examples of bans on exports from People's Republic of China. They hold a dominant position. They earned it, in my opinion, through their foresight and resilience. And it's up to United States, Europe, and other countries to put up a concerted effort to earn part of that market.
That's a very good point. This is actually what we are actually right now pushing for at the New Lines, right? The New Lines Institute, we started this big project about the S7 Plus, kind of pushing these economies, this 5 major economies in Central Asia, along with other economies to work together with and kind of pushing the United States and European Union to actually, exactly like you mentioned, right? Putting serious commitments, serious involvement in the region, rather than just signing MOU or, having one visit from here or one visit from there. So this is totally something we've also been talking about it. I want to discuss with you the September 2025 visit that the presidents of Kazakhstan, Tokayev, made in New York. The president engagement with the United States in 2025 actually began in September in New York, when he traveled to New York, not just for the UN General Assembly, but he actually met and had a high-level business roundtable that included, the head of Chevron. He also met with ExxonMobil, with Visa, with Amazon, and all these big corporations. He emphasized very clearly that U.S. investment in Kazakhstan has already crossed $100 billion. That over 630 American corporations are operating in the country. My question is, what does this business-first approach to U.S. engagement tell us about Tokayev's strategy? And how does it compare to previous Kazakh leaders in terms of how they manage relationship with Washington? If we can do kind of comparisons between how different leaders in Kazakh did and how he's trying to approach it and which approach he's taking.
Well, the approach that President Tokayev is taking is something that we call the multi-vector approach.
Right.
Because of Kazakhstan's geography, they have the longest border in the world with the Russian Federation. They also have a long border with China, and those are two powerful economic partners. So Kazakhstan is always going to have strong economic ties with those two countries. Geography dictates that. Still, the effort in Kazakhstan, and in this case, I would say really very similar policies and pursuits under the first president, Nursultan Nazarbayev, and under President Tokayev now, is to have good business relations and important economic projects, not only with China and Russia, but also with Europe, with the United States. And increasingly, there has been a real growth in business with the Arab world and Gulf nations. The Gulf nations in particular are sources of potential investment, and they've been also stepping up their game, if you will, in Central Asia. And in terms of looking at Central Asia, the broader picture, not just Kazakhstan, but Central Asia, it's very important, I think, to look at the two key countries, which are Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Those are the two key countries. Tajikistan has critical minerals, but they're still at a stage of developing their investment climate and their investment projects where they're, working on, let's say, catching up. Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan have a large border, but under the first president of Kazakhstan and the first president of Uzbekistan, their relationship was really all show. They signed a treaty on eternal friendship, but in fact, they had very little cooperation. So those two presidents are now gone from office, and the relationship between the two countries has changed for the better. It's good for them, and it's good for Central Asia as a whole. They're neighbors, and they're now acting as neighbors. I wouldn't put stock in any talk about the two of these countries merging or anything like that. I don't think either of them have a single thought about that. But they are working differently than they used to.
Right.
And I think that they both understand that, well, yeah, you could say that's a competition to attract investment.
Right.
After all, attracting investment is a competitive game. But I think that both of those countries realize that it's good to have a prosperous neighbor with whom you share certain interests, certain problems, certain goals.
Absolutely. In fact, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this month or last month they discussed idea about water, right?
Yes.
Correct me if I'm missing something, but they
No.
discuss about, and this is a huge, right? I mean,
Water is a massive issue.
Absolutely. So the fact that two countries having history of tensions, now they're sitting on the table discussing, how can we cooperate together on something we both kind of having problem
Yes.
with? That's a good first step
Yes.
toward integrations.
And that is, in fact, a Central Asia issue because Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are also part of that issue of managing water resources, limited, finite water resources that are needed for all the countries of Central Asia. And because of the way that the mountain rivers flow through Central Asia, it requires agreements among those countries to share that water in a way that all four countries can get by economically and develop.
Right, absolutely. I want to touch more with you about the summit because you discussed that the President Trump hold this summit and Kazakhstan was part of this summit. And we've noticed that if you can walk us through the summit, particularly and how each country kind of took this summit and leveraged its summit for its own economic relationships and interests. But I'm particularly interested to learn from you why Kazakhstan, it seems to us that Kazakhstan outpaced its neighbor significantly in terms of like deliverable, but also using and leveraging the summit for relationship with the West. And correct me if I'm missing something here, but it looks like Kazakhstan kind of played a very important role at this summit that was held in November 6, 2025, last year.
No, I agree with you. I think that that's simply a consequence of the policies back in the 90s that were followed by the first president of Kazakhstan and the first president of Uzbekistan, Islam Karimov. President Nazarbayev decided to develop market relations. He decided, if you will, to develop capitalism. He decided to let companies do business, have private property, including things beyond just the consumer economy, including big projects, minerals, oil and gas, etc. Now, most of the three big oil and gas projects were all awarded to foreign oil companies, well-known, highly regarded oil companies. In Uzbekistan, President Karimov took the diametrically opposed path. He wanted to maintain control over the economy. You could say that he wanted to sort of preserve the old order in terms of everything being state-owned and everything being state-controlled. So as a result, Kazakhstan got a big head start in the 90s in terms of developing its investment climate, in terms of specific investment projects that it launched. I can remember, for instance, maybe around 94, 95, I was living in Almaty, called Alma-Ata back then. I was living in Almaty, visited a friend in Tashkent that I'd known in Moscow before. And it was his birthday, and he and his Tashkent friends, Uzbek friends, were all saying, if only we had a president like Nazarbayev who would let us be businessmen. Right?
Okay,
Right.
yeah.
So that was the situation back then, let's say 30 years ago. The fact is, though, that Uzbekistan, since the passing of Islam Karimov and the arrival of President Mirziyoyev, has been making very significant changes and has made it clear that it's open to foreign investment and has been taking specific steps to attract foreign investment. So now they're really operating, if you will, according to the same playbook as Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan still, of course, enjoys that head start that it got back in the day. But right now, I mean, Uzbekistan is basically pursuing all the same things that Kazakhstan has been pursuing. And as I said, there's always a bit of a rivalry when you want to attract foreign investment.
Right.
We want it to come here rather than there.
Right.
But the two countries are behaving like neighbors.
Right.
And that's good for them, and it's good for the region as a whole, in my opinion.
No, absolutely. I mean, this is exactly what we are pushing for. I'm curious about that because you've mentioned something very important. You've mentioned these economies from a geographic standpoint, they share borders with Russia and China.
Mm-hmm.
We also know that these economies are trying to be independent from Russia and China, particularly the Chinese. So they're trying to diversify their relationships and their investments with other actors. And
Yes.
here is the West, including European Union and the United States. My question is, given that you've worked with the Kazakh government and you've had the opportunity to kind of listen to their perceptions, how are they managing interest and different opinions and positions between the Americans and where the Americans stand and versus the Chinese in the region? Because to be honest, we've seen the Chinese investing in education. They're investing in building schools, the study abroad. I wrote a piece coming this week where I mentioned in my piece coming this week where the Chinese are because the people who are not really speaking the Chinese language, but the Chinese are building schools and investing in academic exchange programs. So how are the Kazakh kind of managing these competing interests on both sides?
Well, they're managing that within the framework of their multi-vector policy. They want to have good relationships politically and economically with their two large neighbors, but also with the European Union countries and with the USA and with the Arab Gulf nations. They want to have good, healthy, prosperous relations with all of those parties. So let's say you're Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan. You have a big neighbor, China, right next to you. And in terms of economic cooperation, business between the countries, China has superseded Russia as the main partner. They're now the number one partner. They have the money to do this, and they're doing it. It's part of the Belt and Road Initiative, the Middle Corridor. One reason the Middle Corridor is developing so successfully because it's not just good for those people who want a route to avoid Russia. It's good for China. Absolutely. And because it's good for China, it's happening. Right. So at the same time, both Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan want to do deals with Western companies. Right. And so it is, if you will, a balancing act. Kazakhstan, for instance, has decided to build 3 nuclear power plants. Right. And they awarded the contract for the first plant to Russia, Rosatom. And then for the numbers 2 and 3 stations, they awarded that contract to a Chinese company. Okay. So in other words, they stayed with their powerful neighbors. Right. When it comes to critical minerals, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan have a chance really to diversify, as you said, which they want to do, to have investment come from other countries in other regions. Talking about that summit back in November of 2025, one of the big outcomes there was the fact that a major tungsten project, which consists of 2 tungsten deposits, which everybody knew was available, and which everybody knew the Chinese company Zijin was bidding on. That project was awarded instead to Cove Capital, a U.S. New York-based company. That was a very big moment. Now, that's because Exim Bank and DFC got involved to make the American company's proposal a little more viable. Because we all know that, when the Chinese want a project, they have a lot of money to offer. And also, if you want to just look at the nuts and bolts of things, people in Kazakhstan know very well that if you've got a big project, nobody is going to do it quicker
than the Chinese.
Totally. Nobody.
Absolutely.
Nobody.
Absolutely.
But in the interest of, diversifying their investment profile, in the interests of, their multi-vector policy, they do want to do deals. That's why I think the Gulf states have become more active investing, because they realize that this is something that Kazakhstan wants, a diverse investment profile. Right. And the same, really almost everything that you say about Kazakhstan applies to Uzbekistan. And as I said, those are the 2 engines of development. in Central Asia, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan together.
And I think it's much more difficult for the United States to invest there because China, you have the government investing directly.
Sure.
But in the United States, you have to encourage investors, right?
Absolutely.
And corporations. And corporations and investors might be a little bit hesitant about putting the money and investing there, competing with the Chinese, knowing what the Chinese can offer on the table, right? Versus what we as American investors can offer on the table.
Yeah.
So what do you think those concerns?
Well, you've touched on a very important point,
Right.
an essential point.
Right, yeah.
Washington, let's say, wants for U.S. companies to develop critical minerals projects in Central Asia and in other parts of the world. But Washington cannot dictate to companies, you will go and invest in that.
Right.
In China, as we know, no secret, if the government decides this is a priority, then it immediately becomes a priority for all the Chinese industrial conglomerates.
Exactly.
And so call it state capitalism, call it what you will. It does mean that really the U.S. and the European Union on the one hand and China on the other hand are playing a different game. They're not playing the same game. That's an advantage for China, as you say. That's a fact.
That's a fact. So it's harder on us, kind of.
It's harder. We're farther away, of course. That's always been an issue with Central Asia. At least now, Central Asia, I would say a key change, if you want to sort of give it a description. Central Asia is now being looked at not so much as a route, but as a region.
As a region,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. And what do you think what do you think the U.S. can do for those investors interested to invest there in critical minerals but are hesitant? So what do you think something the U.S. could consider, given exactly the challenges that we both kind of discuss here?
Well, they can do, of course, what they did for Cove Capital, which is simply provide the kind of support that the Exim Bank and the DFC are chartered to provide. We also saw an example of the U.S. Department of Defense, it was still called then, actually taking equity, I think it was 15% in a critical minerals project. So those are very specific things that the U.S. government can do. And as I said, if the Western countries are going to make a dent in China's dominant position, then the U.S. and Europe are going to need to make use of mechanisms like that.
Exactly, totally. I do want to switch gears and talk about the Board of Peace. The big thing everyone is kind of discussing, what's going on, why Central Asia is part of this meetings. We know that the January 2026 at Davos, President Tokayev officially signed the charter that Trump called the Board of Peace, a multilateral framework linked to Trump 20-point for Gaza peace plan. My questions are, what is driving Astana decision to join that agreement, these organizations, and to insert itself as a very complicated politics in Gaza, especially that you mentioned something very important. You've talked about how the Gulf countries are interested in Kazakhstan or interested in Central Asia.
Yes.
Don't you think this is like a difficult kind of point that you are joining the Gaza peace plan and maybe kind of losing some individuals interested in investing in your country? Because a lot of the Gulf countries have their own positions on Gaza. I mean, Saudi Arabia has been clear, other Qatar, all of them have been clear on Gaza and what's going on.
Yes.
So
yeah, Gaza, of course, was at the very origin of creating the Board of Peace. But of course, the Board of Peace has now become something broader than simply a solution to the Gaza problem.
Right.
And that's because President Trump wanted it to be something more than just that.
Right.
So if you're Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan, both of whom are participating actively, equally active in the Board of Peace, to me it's really very simple. Their relationship with the United States has changed. Let's say last November as a milestone, right? It's changed now. They're being paid attention to. They're feeling an interest, even a need, because of the critical minerals first and foremost. So joining the Board of Peace was an absolute no-brainer for Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, because this allows them to develop the rapport that they now have with Washington and with President Trump. The fact that he invited them means that they are, in fact, on his radar.
Right.
And so, of course, they accepted. And when it comes to the, let's say, political difficulties of joining an organization that was formed originally to solve the Gaza issue, which is a very contentious issue,
Right.
especially if you're talking about working with Arab and Gulf countries
Exactly.
because of their intimate connection to Gaza. All I can say is this. For Kazakhstan, complicated political situations are nothing new. They've been in a complicated political situation since the day they became independent in December 25, 1991. And they will always be in a complicated political position because of their geography, because of their neighbors. You know, you can't choose your neighbors. So they're used to it. President Tokayev is a professional diplomat.
Right.
To me, just my personal view, my personal observations, he's doing a very good job with this complicated, this sort of just complicated setting in which he carries out his policies, his foreign policies. So I don't see, and you could say the same thing about Uzbekistan too. I don't see this as a problem for Kazakhstan. Whatever complicated issues arrive within the Board of Peace when they talk specifically about Gaza, I mean, President Tokayev is the one who went to the World Economic Forum in St. Petersburg,
Right.
sat on a stage with President Vladimir Putin, and when asked by the moderator, well, what do you think about our special military operation, which we consider so necessary? What did he say? He said, we're not in on that. We're not going to recognize Lugansk. We're not going to recognize Donetsk because that's not what the UN says. We're in favor of international law, and what has been established by the UN, we will follow, so we won't be recognized.
Right.
Is that complicated? Yeah, that's pretty complicated.
Totally.
But President Tokayev handles that stuff.
And very interesting because when we looked at the details about how Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan actually contribute to the Gaza peace plan, their contribution is not it's not major. Like
No.
they have, so which is interesting. So the participation is it nominal, more like signaling to the administration that we welcome any kind of initiatives that because the contribution is not significant in terms of.
No. I think the more significant contributions would come from the countries with A, the larger economies, but B, the bigger stake in that specific issue of Gaza.
Right.
So I think my understanding is that Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan have both expressed a willingness to participate, if that means financially, if that means in terms of personnel, then they'll participate. But they wouldn't even, if you think about it logically, they wouldn't be asked to come in and play the leading role.
Right.
So I believe that they're ready to play the role that suits them. They want to be part of this organization. It's important for them to maintain their momentum right now in attracting investment and in doing everything they can so that America and Europe and everyone else looks upon them as an important region and not just a trade route.
That's an important. I want to go back to some positions and views that has been addressed by Gulf actors, Gulf leaders, when they knew that Kazakhstan is officially joining the Board of Peace. And so Hamas called that decision justifying genocide. Some Gulf leaders who condition normalizations on Palestinian statehood view Astana step unfavorably.
Yep.
And Kazakhstan's own Muslim population, which we know it's large, we have around 70% of Muslim populations, may have complex feelings about this decision and may see this decision as really kind of the country attempt to join the Abraham Accord and be supporting with Israel. So my question is really, how are you handling the internal tensions? And I know he's a very good diplomat, but this is really an internal tensions going on in the region. and also domestic and regional risk, that you have connections with Arab leaders. So the fact that you even just joined is creating those tensions internally and in the regions without really serious contributions.
Well, if you're in Kazakhstan's position or Uzbekistan's position, right?
And you have 70% population who are Muslims too.
Yes, probably even more in Uzbekistan.
Right.
Plus, the difference is that Uzbekistan has a much stronger tradition simply of people practicing Islam than Kazakhstan does, if you look historically. So, this was never going to be easy. As they say, if it were easy, anybody could do it.
Right.
It's not easy.
Yeah.
But the decision to join the Board of Peace makes sense for them. If it complicates their relationship with Hamas, I don't think that bothers Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, President Mirziyoyev or President Tokayev so much, because they're not about developing political bilateral relations with Hamas.
Right.
But they are all about having a strong relationship with the Gulf states, and they want that. And to the extent that joining the Board of Peace may rock the boat a little bit there, well, that's something that Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan will have to live with and have to accept and have to try and mitigate as best they can by talking to the Gulf states and explaining why they made that decision. I mean, in the end, all countries make decisions based on what is good for their country.
Right.
So Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan are both obliged to be flexible about things. And again, the multi-vector policy means you balance relationships and you maintain good relationships with countries who, between themselves, don't have a good relationship. But you have a good relationship with this country, and you have a good relationship with that country, but they have a bad relationship with each other. Well, welcome to Kazakhstan's world.
Right.
And that's something that President Tokayev balances. As I said, I believe he does a very good job at that. And so for me, them joining the Board of Peace makes sense. Although I understand issues about Gaza, and we're not here to comment on that. If we were, you'd be probably interviewing somebody else. But I have my feelings about that, and so I completely understand the concern and feelings even stronger than concern.
How do you envision the relationship between Kazakhstan and the Arab countries? Do you think those relationships are growing? Do you see any challenges?
When it comes to the Gulf countries, as we've said, Kazakhstan wants to have a healthy relationship and wants them to invest in their countries, same as Uzbekistan wants them to invest. So I believe that President Mirziyoyev, President Tokayev will do everything they can to keep an open channel of communication with their partners in the Gulf nations and try and mitigate the effects that arise because of them joining this Board of Peace.
Right, but which Gulf countries do you think this relationship might be mostly growing, between which economies, and which one will have more challenges? Like, what do you see the challenges might be going with this relationship right now emerging?
Well, we'll see. If you look at Oman, Qatar, and the Emirates,
right.
There's always a big business element to their foreign policy.
Right.
I think maybe Saudi Arabia traditionally has been a little different, although I'm not saying that there isn't that element in their foreign policy. These are the countries that matter most to Central Asia, to be honest, because they're the potential investors.
Right.
I know that Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan maintain cordial relations with the other Arab countries, but those countries are not big potential investors. And so those relationships are a little different.
Especially with Oman and UAE.
Yeah, those are important. Qatar, those are important relationships for Kazakhstan. As I said, I believe that President Tokayev and President Mirziyoyev will do what they can to mitigate the concern that joining the Board of Peace has raised in those countries.
I do want to switch some gears and talk about the Trump route for international peace and prosperity trip that we all know about it. Can you discuss and share with individuals and listeners who may not be familiar with the trip routes? why this corridor is important for Kazakhstan, and why do you think this move supported and endorsed by the United States is really a big move that the United States started for Central Asia? Why is that important?
Well, that corridor, which has been always known as the Zangezur corridor and now is known as TRIP, it exists because Azerbaijan is divided into two pieces.
Right.
Armenia juts down and has a common border with Iran, and that leaves these sort of two pieces of Azerbaijan. And the idea was to solve that problem so that exports could go from Baku, from Azerbaijan, including trans-Caspian deliveries, and go through that corridor to reach the western section of Azerbaijan and then go into Turkey, or from Turkey go up to the Black Sea, or simply through Turkey to the Mediterranean Sea. So that will be important. That will make the whole transportation modes along the middle corridor more efficient. So there's definitely a value there. Now, President Trump stepped in there to move the two countries toward a peace agreement, and that was successful at the time. And then the corridor being a big business opportunity, the United States gained the rights to lead that process. So we'll see specifically what happens there, but fiber optic, other cables, along that. Obviously, Iran is not happy that this is happening.
Right.
So we'll see what that is. But of course, it seems right now Iran and the U.S. have bigger issues.
Right.
But that's an issue. Iran is unhappy about that. Armenia, of course, has reoriented itself since the Second Karabakh War because I think the Armenians have realized, maybe not the diaspora in the United States, but I think that in Armenia, they've accepted the fact that this is over. Right? It's over for now. So they're sort of joining the game. And, because they were really sidelined before.
They were, yeah.
Georgia and Azerbaijan were plugged into the middle corridor in a very, important way. And Armenia was totally out.
Exactly.
So that's all going to at least be, mitigated. It's going to change. Armenia is getting more involved. Kazakhstan is now delivering wheat to Armenia through Azerbaijan. Right. So those things are happening, things that were not happening before.
But how Moscow is reacting to that? I'm curious to hear from you.
How who?
How Moscow, how Moscow is likely kind of to interpret this kind of Kazakhstan alignment with the U.S., build infrastructure, not to mention the Chinese position. Yeah.
Well, I think that Moscow is looking on that with a big frown, to be honest.
Right.
Especially, the U.S. being so intimately involved in an important project with two post-Soviet republics.
Exactly.
Right. So, of course, they're unhappy. And, of course, right now they're unable to exert really any influence on that process.
The Ukrainian war.
Yeah, their treasury is, stressed, let's say.
Of course, yeah.
So they're forced to basically observe this initiative happening.
Yep.
And of course, they did have a very tight relationship with Armenia, supporting it, if you will, against Azerbaijan. Mm-hmm. But when the Second Karabakh War was launched, so for Azerbaijan to regain its territory, I think Armenia was counting on Russia to step in. Mm-hmm. The collective security treaty organization, and Russia didn't do that. Probably because President Erdogan said, if you do that, then we're not going to be friends anymore. Exactly. That, of course, is a big strength of Azerbaijan that they have. Turkey, yes, yep. Absolutely. So the corridor is important. But we haven't seen any specific transactions or anything like that. Right. But for now, the momentum there is good. Let's hope that the corridor moves forward. Obviously, it'll be good for Azerbaijan and for Armenia, good for the middle corridor as a whole, good for Central Asia because it offers additional capacities that can actually even be quicker then going across, going from, let's say, Azerbaijan to Georgia and then across the Black Sea.
Right.
This can be a straighter line. Obviously, there's some things that you'll need to send on ships to get them to Europe.
Right.
From the middle corridor. But there are other things that maybe don't have to go on ships. Well, now you've got this corridor. Presumably, assuming that it all goes forward the way it's being planned.
Right. Speaking about Azerbaijan, in November 2025, the same month as Washington kind of supported and endorsed the C5+1 summit, we've seen Azerbaijan being invited. Azerbaijan was invited to join this format, effectively kind of turning the C5 to C6. Some analysts here in Washington describe this move as the most consequential move for Central Asian states, kind of summit since independence, that Azerbaijan is joining. And so what does this kind of joining of Azerbaijan really mean for the role of Azerbaijan in Central Asia? And also in terms of the directions of Central Asian state political corporations, like how much are they all willing to cooperate? We know that the United States has a hesitant relationship with Azerbaijan, with the situation with Armenia, but what does that mean when Azerbaijan is joining?
I think that it's very important for Central Asia that Azerbaijan has been invited to make C5 C6.
Right.
It's actually very logical. In fact, at CPC has been talking in favor of that happening for some time, making it C6. So now that's happened. It's important for Azerbaijan, of course. I would say this. I would say that, yes, you're right that America and Azerbaijan had a difficult relationship because of Armenia.
Exactly.
But that's changing now.
That's changing.
I think that the groundwork is there for that relationship to change, for the United States to drop its sort of automatic reaction against Azerbaijan, and develop a more pragmatic relationship with Azerbaijan. I mean, that's the logic of what's happening now in the South Caucasus.
I want to discuss more with you because of your experience in Kazakhstan and inside the government. Those economies really are post-Soviet economies, right? They're trying to build their own economies. They're trying to build their own identity, being independent from Russia and all the Soviet kind of authoritarian learning, right? How do you see this is happening based on your experience on the ground, kind of building their own language, their own identity? I've seen this happening, for example, a lot of them are trying to teach their national language, the Kazakh language.
Yes.
This is wonderful, but from a state capacity, from an institution standpoint, how is that seeing happening? And also kind of competing for bilateral deals and bilateral agreement, like building your own independent identity.
Well, of course, identity is a big issue.
Exactly. 100%.
For all of the post-Soviet countries, but in particular for Kazakhstan, because it was the most Russified republic in the Soviet Union.
Exactly.
Again, I mean, you've got a border that's like 4,000 miles long. And at the time, in the late period of the Soviet Union, and when it collapsed finally in December 91, the estimate was that 40% of the population was Russian. Okay, so now that's under 20, according to the statistics. So that has changed. And the whole issue of identity has changed dramatically since independence, dramatically, including what I think is really, if you will, maybe the most important indicator, and that's the Kazakh language, right? So when I moved to Almaty in 1992, I would have had to really work to find a Kazakh in Almaty, not in all of Kazakhstan, no. But in Almaty, I would have had to work to find a Kazakh who spoke Kazakh, right? That's all gone, thank goodness. That's all changed. Kazakhs speak Kazakh amongst themselves. I'm not saying that Russian is not an important language for people to communicate. But the importance of the Kazakh language, the recognition of its importance, teaching in schools and all that has changed dramatically over the 30-some years of independence. And let's be honest, the war against Ukraine has really caused a big spike in that whole view on, no, let's speak our language. Let's try, if we can, to get by that way. If I'm in Kazakhstan with someone, I don't speak good Kazakh. and I need to speak with someone and they don't speak good English, well, guess what? We speak Russian. But
Yes.
so that's, that's reality.
Right.
But it's not at all like it used to be.
Right.
Not at all. I mean, you didn't used to hear Kazakhs walking around in Astana and Almaty speaking Kazakh with each other, and now that's routine.
That's routine, which is a good sign toward building
Of course
your own
it is.
independence
Of course
and
it is.
being your own
Yeah,
state.
No, identity has changed
It's
dramatically.
right.
And again, war in Ukraine, kind of accelerated that whole feeling. Because when the war in Ukraine began, it really shook up a lot of people in Kazakhstan, because they were all part of the same country for their whole lives, basically. Right. And now all of a sudden they see war happening in places where, let's say they visited and where they have people that they know, and then they see this happening, the bloodshed, the death, the deprivation. It's had a big impact on people.
Right. And then I do want to talk about the G20 summit coming up. President Trump has invited the President Kazakh Tokayev to the G20 summit.
And President Mirziyoyev.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The president to the G20 summit happening in 2026 in Miami.
Mm-hmm.
They're both going to be, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, their leaders going to also follow visiting Kazakhstan. An extraordinarily important moment. What concrete the agenda going to look like? Concrete agenda items do you think going to look like for Kazakh to push for on these high-level meeting settings?
Well, one of the first things that Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan will push for is for the United States Congress to finally repeal the Jackson-Vanik Act, because that's so outdated and so irrelevant to today's reality.
Exactly.
It's very irrelevant and it's very outdated, but it's also rather complicated to do that.
Right.
It involves amending an old trade act, but that's something that needs to happen, obviously, if you're Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan. Beyond that, I wouldn't presume to, to sort of imagine what that agenda will be. We're still months away from that G20. It's important that Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan were invited. Right. Very important. Right. Very important. They'll be there. That's more visibility, helps them develop more supportive relationships with other countries, and to, pursue their agenda of attracting investment and developing business ties. Right.
Thank you so much, Richard. I have one last question. So I know we've talked about Russia, we've talked about China, we've talked about Gulf countries. And then we've talked about the peace organizations. My last question is, if you had to identify the single greatest risk to the U.S.-Kazakh partnership over the next 2 years, and the simple greater opportunity for both of them, what would it be? One big risk that kind of can, threaten, and one big opportunity for their growing relationship.
Well, I think the big opportunity is simply to continue on the course they're on with the critical minerals. With the railroads, that enormous railroad deal between the U.S. and Kazakhstan. And really all things logistical. Obviously, in Kazakhstan's oil industry, America plays a big role in their three major projects. So
the oil industry.
The oil industry, yeah. Just to continue that and to develop new business in critical minerals. Assuming that the U.S. is ready to use instruments, like EXIM and Development Finance Corporation. So I would say when it comes to, the opportunities, it's just to carry on the present course and develop it and make sure that keep it on track. The risks, of course, it's hard to foresee risks. Right. Things can happen that can change the calculus quickly, but I think that China, which of course is the biggest trade partner and the biggest investor in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, I think that they're a little different from Moscow in the way they look at things. Yeah. I don't think they have this thing about, we have to control everything.
They're strategic.
They're strategic. And the fact is, let's stop and ask ourselves a question. What is it in Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan that China really wants or wanted that it doesn't have or didn't get? Right. Rather little, I would say.
Right.
I would say that they're satisfied in general with the economic and business relationship they have with Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. They're going to carry it on. That's good for Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. Let's be honest. It's good for them to have that relationship. The business volume of business with Russia is shrinking, but it's still significant. There's a very important degree of integration between the economies of Kazakhstan and Russia left over from the Soviet Union, and it's in the benefit of both countries to keep that going. You have a lot of enterprises in Kazakhstan that depend on deliveries from Russian enterprises and vice versa, and you have, enterprises in both countries whose main customers are on the other side of the border. So, it's in the interest of both countries to continue that. So barring any major, geopolitical, military events, I think the path is clear. Continue on the path that Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan are on to develop their business basically 360 degrees around their border.
Right. Thank you so much, Richard, for your comments. This is very helpful and very informative, given that you are coming from the region also in your own experience. Thank you so much for everyone watching us.